everyone. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, September 12th. My name is Heather Kraus, and I'm a mathematical statistician and the founder of an organization called We All Count that is committed to building tools and finding ways to work together to align the data projects that we do with the community values and the equity goals of those projects. And you have made it to our weekly gathering, which is called Talking Data Equity, where anybody who's also interested in that project is welcome to come and learn together. And you will notice that we are recording this today. And the purpose of recording this is so that we can share it in the Talking Data Equity forum. For people who can't attend live. We have lots of people for lots of personal and professional reasons that want to learn together, but can't attend this particular time. So we will share back the recording and lots of links and resources to what we're going to be talking about today. So before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that the land that I'm hosting this conversation on is the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and that the dispossession, the removal, and the state-sanctioned genocide against Indigenous people is not confined to the past. As we talk about frequently here at Talking Data Equity, economic marginalization, data extraction, and the potential looming extinction of native languages is still happening and being paid for right now by many of our organizations and institutions. Part of our commitment to the truth and reconciliation process is to tell the truth about this. And our actions towards reconciliation include, but aren't limited to, asking ourselves every time we as a business decide to do something, is what we're considering doing a positive impact of this on the social, economic, or political standings of Native communities, and then checking with Native communities to find out if our ideas about what might be good or helpful actually is. Also, as a business, We All Count engages in economic reconciliation by donating 5% of all of our profits to data projects that are owned and operated by Indigenous people. And this quarter, all of that economic reconciliation goes to somebody that many of you know, Dr. Crystal Sosi, Diné Navajo Nation. Dr. Sosi runs the Native Biodata Consortium, which, as far as we can tell, is the only genomics research lab that is based on indigenous land and is fully embodying Indigenous data sovereignty in the genomics sector. So I want to, with that in mind, turn us to the topic that we're going to have a conversation about today, which is Indigenous statistics. And we have a very, very special guest who's joining us on quite an eventful week. That is Dr. Chris Andersen. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Andersen in just a second. But before I do, let me set up what the housekeeping is going to look like. We're here together till about 1. And today we're going to have a conversation about Indigenous statistics. What is that? How can we think about it? How can we apply that to our projects? How can we acknowledge where harm is being done? And how can we get better at not doing harm? And while we do that, while Chris and I have a conversation, we really want you to feel invited into that conversation. We know we're on Zoom. We know Zoom is weird. You can't always read the social clues or know how to participate. But we really want you to reflect, share, not just sit passively and listen to Chris and I talk, which we could probably do for many, many hours. So we have a small enough group that if you want to turn your microphone on at any point to contribute a reflection, to ask a question, to share a response, you can feel free to do that. If you want a little more formality, you can go ahead and raise your Zoom hand. So in Zoom reactions, there's something called raise your hand, which you could push that. And then I, as the kind of Zoom host, can see your hand go up and I can call on people in the order that their hands went up. But if that's confusing or you're on your phone or something, you don't have to do that to talk. You can turn your microphone on and we'll do our best to have a conversation on Zoom. If you're not comfortable with your microphone, you can use the Zoom chat. You can put questions, reflections, comments into the Zoom chat, and we'll also incorporate that. Okay, so I think that that is enough about housekeeping. I'll just say one more time because people are already asking me in the chat. Yes, we are going to share recordings. We're going to share all kinds of resources. We're going to share that in the Data Equity Forum, which I just put the link in the chat. I will also put the link in the chat again, but you don't have to write all of this down. We are going to share this back with you. So you can just listen and be part of the conversation today. Okay. So our guest is Dr. Chris Andersen. And when I invited Chris to come and join us, it was because of having read a lot of his work. He, of course, contributed to a book that many of us are familiar here with. I don't know if it's called co-author or co-editor, but major contributor to the book Indigenous Statistics from Data Deficits to Data Sovereignty, which I know a lot of us have read. Also, a book called Métis, which I highly recommend, completely re-educated me on a lot of mistakes I had been making as a data practitioner in Canada. And a number of articles, fantastic, really practical interviews about what is Indigenous statistics and how to think about it. And when I invited Chris at the time, I believe that, Chris, you were the Dean of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. And I believe that changed like in the last few days.
Not for another 2 weeks, Heather.
Oh, okay, okay. So in about 2 weeks, Chris will actually be a Dean and Vice Provost of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, which if you're not in the academic world, you might not know the various, what that means. And I'll just summarize it by saying that is a very big deal. And we are very, very, very excited to see the University of Alberta make this investment and take advantage of this fantastic opportunity to have Chris in this position. I'm not going to read you all of the rest of Chris's bio. We will share that in the resources. Instead, Chris, I just want to say welcome. Thank you for joining us. And would you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in Indigenous statistics?
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to come and listen to us chat. I'm very honored by it. I'm Métis. I'm originally from the Parkland region of Saskatchewan. I don't know if anybody here is from Saskatchewan at all, but I grew up in and around Prince Albert, from a very large Métis family in that region. My last name's Andersen, but my mom's name was Arkand, so part of the big Arkand family from that region. I How did I get interested in Indigenous statistics? I was originally quite quantitative. My master's degree was a logistic regression analysis of regional victimization rates in Canada. I started to do my PhD. I was doing linear structural equation modeling in my PhD, and after having done 2 courses on it, I couldn't come to terms with the epistemological errors between what we said we were going to measure and then what we actually ended up measuring. And you can't get more sophisticated, or at the time you couldn't get more sophisticated than structural equation modeling for trying to map these things out. And then I was chatting with a friend, and she said, "Well, why don't you just do discourse analysis if that's what you're really interested in?" And so now I tend to introduce myself as a recovering statistician because I haven't done a lot of frontline data analysis. There's enough people out there that do that kind of thing that I trust, that I can go to when I need information from. My big shtick, which I talk about in the book, and I do a lot of work with frontline data users, is we're fools to think that we can create good relationships from good numbers. But it is possible to create good numbers if we had good relationships, right? Because it doesn't matter kind of the epistemological context that we operate in. It's about governance. It's about what relationality looks like in the context of the kinds of things that we're working with. And so I got interested originally when I was writing my dissertation. It was originally on a court case that was just coming out at the time called the Pally decision. It was the first Métis rights case to go before the Supreme Court of Canada. And as I got into that, I started looking at some of the numbers they were using to make some of their arguments, and they didn't make any sense to me because that was the time when, unlike First Nations who have been measured for better or worse over since really since 1871, Métis don't really get counted as Métis until about 1996. There's some previous stuff that happens in 1991, but it starts in earnest in 1996, and the numbers just shoot through the roof. And so when I chatted with demographers about it, they started talking about, now we talk about it as ethnic mobility. At the time, they talked about it as ethnic drift. This whole idea that people change their idea of who they are from one census to another. And so I got really interested in how and why people would do that, and then from that got interested in sort of the different definitions that folks had about what the term Métis actually means. And so then I was on the advisory committee on social conditions for Statistics Canada for a number of years, and just got into long-standing, not 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 debates, because the people that work for Stats Canada, especially a lot of the Indigenous people, are amazing at what they do, and I have a huge
Mhm.
amount of respect for the situation that they're in. But in this day and age, so much of what we do is based on self-identification that they have no statistical ability really to move away and not count self-identification as the basis for making whatever demographic claims that are being made. Sorry, Heather, I'm sort of going off on a tangent here, but
Not at all.
that's how I got into all of this, was sort of thinking conceptually about what are the limits of self-identification for making claims to indigeneity, and what do we either replace or add to that in order to make those more robust, more ethical, more equitable claims.
Thank you so much. So for people who are just having their first introduction to Dr. Anderson's work, you can see why it is so exciting, because I feel like you're really just getting absolutely to the heart of a problem that so many people, I think, overcomplicate. I read in one of your books, or maybe it was in an interview, where you said sometimes people like to take complicated things and make them simple, and you think
Mm.
Indigenous statistics take simple things and make them complicated.
Yeah.
And I have so much respect and relief when I hear that, as a statistician, because this idea that quantitative analysis simplifies things is a real red flag for me. I think we should take a minute, because not everybody here is from Canada. Not everybody here is even from North America. Um, so and talk about what does the word Métis mean? And I will absolutely say I had a deep stereotypical white Canadian misunderstanding of what the word Métis meant until I started reading your work and thought, wow, like I work hard to try and understand equity issues and identity, and it took me a long time to find somebody for me to get exposed to the truth.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
what is this word Métis for people who are not from this continent at all?
Yeah. Métis is not the word that I or we use back home when we talk about ourselves. We use
Yes.
Michif, which is the same word as our language, but the way that most people understand us and other people who use an allied term is Métis. And so Métis is basically caught on between two poles. On the one hand, you have a national understanding of Métis, so it's tied to particular territories, movements, leaders, language, land tenure, all of the kinds of things that you would associate with nationhood. And then on the other hand, the term Métis is used to denote mixedness. And so when the census started collecting information on people self-identifying as Métis, they didn't know what the person meant when they used the term Métis. They didn't know if they were referring to it in a national context, and they didn't know whether they were referring to it simply to demonstrate that what they'll say is a mixed Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal ancestry, but what it actually means, in fact, almost always, as someone who has one Indigenous parent but didn't grow up in community. Because if you grew up in community, then generally speaking, unless it was a Métis community, you're not going to call yourself Métis. You're going to call yourself whatever community that was part of. But those are kind of the two poles. There's a racialized pole, which is just about kind of mixedness, and then there's a much more kind of nationhood-based pole, which is based on the Métis Nation. And until recently, the census had no ability to differentiate between the two. And they knew that, by the way.
That's cool. So thank you, first of all, for clarifying. For people who are just getting used to the words, and for reminding me that Métis is not really ever the self-identification word, right? Like
Mhm.
Métis is an outside in word.
Yeah, but it's one that, just in fairness to the different provincial Métis governments, everybody uses Métis as the
Okay,
kind of the lingua franca of talking in English to the Canadian state and to folks within the province. So it's not an uncommon word. We all use it as well,
okay,
but just people from a particular area in Western Canada also use Michif as a way to differentiate. In fact, when I went to university, I did my undergrad at Queen's. I switched referring to myself as Métis and started referring to myself as Michif because I couldn't differentiate between people couldn't differentiate between what the term meant. And so when I would call myself Michif, they'd say, "What does that mean?" And then I'd have the opportunity to explain to them what it actually meant.
right, right. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And if I'm correct, it was about 2021 that Statistics Canada, up until that point, again, for people who don't see the Canadian census is run a little bit differently than the American census and the censuses from other nations that collect Indigenous data, in that we don't collect Indigenous data first and foremost as part of a race question.
Yeah.
We collect it as a indigeneity question.
Well, we do both actually, Heather. So there's an
Okay,
ethnic ancestry question where that comes as one of the options, and so I guess that's kind of a proxy
right.
for race, but not in the same way it would be, say, in the U.S. Census. So there's two different sets of questions that get asked, but generally speaking, most of the demographic information that we use in Canada comes off the indigeneity question, not off the ethnicity question.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Did I just mansplain you? Was that just a different way of
No,
saying the
no,
same
not at
thing?
all.
Okay.
Absolutely not. No,
Okay.
not even close. No, I'm just trying to get it all straight. And in the indigeneity question, before 2021, one of the options, and we're just going to call it a drop down. I don't know if technically it's a drop down, but let's just call it a drop down, a list of categories that somebody can check. One of them just said Métis.
Yeah.
And when people checked that box, the census had no idea. I'm saying this so you can say, yeah, yes, you got this, or no, let me help you fix your understanding. Some people thought, oh, one of my ancestors, grandma, mom, grandpa, is Indigenous or First Nations. I haven't grown up in community with that nation. And so I'm not going to check like Cree or Anishinaabe. So I'm going to check Métis,
Yeah.
because I am thinking of myself as like partly Indigenous and partly not.
Yeah.
And
That's
then
that's exactly right.
other people, and that's kind of the racialized idea of Métis, and then other people actually did grow up in a First Nations community, which would, maybe they thought of themselves as mischief, and they see
Mischief.
mischief,
Yeah.
mischief. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Although we often joke about ourselves as being mischief, but that's yeah.
I've only ever seen it in writing, so
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't know how to pronounce it. Thank you so much. And so that's like a relational or a community or a nation idea of Métis, and Statistics Canada knew that it had no way to know who had checked the box from like a quote unquote racial idea, and who had checked the box from the quote unquote, well, not quote unquote, the actual community
Yeah.
nation idea. Is
Yeah.
that okay? And then in 2021, they added some clarification to that.
Yeah, they laid out the different Métis provincial governments, and people had the option of checking off one of those, and then the Métis settlements in Alberta as well. And interesting, I will say that's exactly the solution I proposed in the 2014 book. So I'm not
Yeah.
saying they lifted it directly from the book. Even if they did, I'd be more than happy for them to have done it. But it is it is very strongly corresponding to the logic that I made a logical argument I made in the book, but it's better, but it's still, it surfaces a gap in terms of how people think about themselves as well.
Thank you. And has it helped? Part of the one of the issues that you write about in your work is, and you mentioned it here, is this kind of radical, like demographically impossible increase in the number of people in Canada who are like getting tagged as Métis in social statistics and government statistics. So has adding this slightly more nuanced set of checkboxes, has that helped us get a realistic idea of what those counts might be? It hasn't helped, no.
No, no, because you have lots of people who are
Yeah,
legitimately Métis, and in many cases, legitimately part of those organizations who still didn't check off being part of the organizations for whatever reason. I mean,
right,
StatsCan spends I'm not sure what it is now, but at the time that I was doing work, they were spending between $3 and $5 million a year just on pre-testing the questions.
right.
So there's lots of different reasons why folks do what they do, and maybe if there's someone who's from StatsCan here, they might know the answer to that. But yeah, I mean it's it's better, but we need two more censuses to get a sense of to let it kind of like sit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sheila, go ahead. Hi. We can't hear you yet. We heard you for a second and then you got muted.
Hello?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Hi, apologies. I'm on my phone. Uh Hello. Thank you so much for hosting this chat today and for sharing your sort of knowledge and expertise and wisdom with us. I am also in Treaty 6 territory. I'm also in Amiskwachie, which is Edmonton. And I work for the city. And one of the things we're working on right now is trying to figure out how to collect race disaggregated data, and there's a lot of different levels to that. I was in Heather's session yesterday, and we talked about even how if you're going to self-select sort of demographic information, even those are even that is super problematic. So all that to say, I'm wondering if, Professor, you can suggest the best example you have or that you use for when you are inviting Indigenous peoples to identify their sort of their ethnicity. Like obviously you mentioned the use of the term Métis works in some ways, doesn't work in other places. Maybe it's not comprehensive enough.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'd be really interested in your answer to that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the default answer I always give, and it sounds like a cop out, but I promise you it's not, is to have a conversation with representative organizations about what nomenclature or what terminology they actually prefer to use, because there may be some terminology that could get used that's not perfect and certainly wouldn't be their, like for example, even just using a word like Cree as opposed to Nihiao. There's reasons why one would use Cree, especially for Cree folks that didn't grow up speaking the language, as a way to be kind of as expansive as possible in terms of in terms of building kind of a policy relevant demographic profile. So I wouldn't presume to say in advance what that would actually look like, but it would be good to get a sense of what communities um, and what representative organizations in particular you would have conversations with in order to figure out what the appropriate terminology actually would be.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I can't remember, Chris, if you said this while we were getting ready for today or why you said this live today, but the idea that you can't grow good relationships out of good data, but you can grow good data out of good relationships. Did you say that here or is that
Yeah,
before?
I said that here because and maybe I'll hop into one of the questions that you asked me,
Yeah,
Heather.
please
That
do.
for me, and you and others can correct me if you feel differently about it. But for me, the essence of data is about abstracting from local context. That's the whole point of data, right? So you have locally situated knowledge. So an example I often give when I'm working with frontline users, frontline data users, is say you're back home someplace and you're driving out in the field and you get stuck and you have to call a sibling or a relative to come get you. What's the easiest way to tell them where you are? You could drop them a pin. That would be an easy thing to do. But if they know exactly where you are and they're from the same territory, they don't need that. You can just say, "Hey, you remember where Uncle Chubby hit that beaver on the way back from the dance? Blah 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 blah. It's just past that on the way to." We have most of the information we need in a local context in order to kind of like make good decisions about how we live and go about our lives. The whole point of data is to abstract from local context to give sort of broader lenses for looking at kind of a wider socio or a geopolitical space. And so the issue then becomes if we know that there's that abstracting is the essence of data, then whoever we are, whether it's Indigenous folks, whether you work for a justice organization or whatever, the point is to be involved in as many different parts of the cycle as you can be and take leadership roles wherever you can to make sure that you control what that abstraction process actually looks like. We know we're losing the richness of local context when we use data. That's not the problem. The problem is when we don't get to control the abstraction process to what the data actually become. And
Mhm.
so, you know, I've argued, and demographers in particular get pissed off at me for this, and I have a huge amount of respect for the work that demographers do, but um, I'm not interested, and I don't think any of us should be interested in the technical accuracy of data. I think we should depend on the professional investments of people that work to make data as accurate as possible. We don't want shit data. We want data to sort of have all of the things it needs to have in order to be considered good quality data. But you can have really technically accurate data, and if it doesn't align with the values that your organization or that your nation says you espouse, then it can still end up being shit data. This is how we get all this deficit-based data that gets produced. It could be technically accurate, but if it's not in alignment with the things that we say that we value, then who gives a shit if it's technically accurate?
I could not agree more. I'm I really, really am so grateful for you just putting it so clearly and so rigorously. I really like the clarity and explicitness. So, like, if we follow up on that, because I would like to kind of talk about this topic a little more about, why bother with data and statistics, and is it possible? I mean, I have been struggling with this question for decades since I started learning about math and statistics. Is it even possible to kind of simultaneously believe in Indigenous data sovereignty and quantitative statistics? Do you think that there is an overlap in that Venn diagram if we are attentive?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because we live in a data saturated world. I mean, we live in an increasingly deified world. Um, just to give an example,
Mhm.
people often like to talk about being online or being offline as though these are sort of like two different spaces. Even if you were to um, head out to the bush, leave your cell phone at home, go to a cabin with no electricity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You still have all the data that's been collected about you since you were a little kid and right up until the moment where you put your phone down. And even the fact that you put your phone down is going to be used as evidence for something. There's no, I mean, I have no interest in getting into a huge argument about whether stuff exists outside of colonialism, but I will say that
Mhm.
almost everything that we do in our lives, from the moment we get up until the moment that we go to bed, is saturated in data. So all the ways that for
Mhm.
Indigenous folks we think we are being traditional, we are being traditional, but it is co-constituted by the datafied world that we live in. So for me, data sovereignty is dipping our foot into a river that's already flowing. There's no,
Mhm.
you can't pretend that the river isn't there. And and it's I'll tell you guys a story if we have time for a quick story. I had a Indigenous student once in my class about uh, maybe 15 years ago. It was just after Facebook came out, and he was complaining to me that he wanted to do an oral exam for his final exam. And I said, well, no, you have to do a written exam. This was laid out at the beginning of the year, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, well, that's colonial, and I don't want to, I don't want to participate in it. And there was an Indigenous woman in the class, and she said, hang on, so just so I'm straight on this, you're telling me that writing is colonial? And he said, yes. And she said, you're on Facebook every night for 3 hours writing stuff, and you seem to have no trouble at that point. So why is this colonial and that's not? Well, that's different. She's like, great, let's have a conversation about how that's different. And of course, he didn't want to have the conversation. But the point is that all of that is baked into the cake already. So for me, Indigenous
Right.
knowledge is anything that helps Indigenous folks,
Mhm.
whether it's qualitative, quantitative, whatever. And again, ceremonial people get up in arms when I make those kinds of statements, and I'm quite happy to maintain a distinction between ceremonial knowledge and non-ceremonial knowledge.
Mhm.
But I
Mhm.
think as Indigenous folks in particular, when we try and um, when we try and back ourselves into a corner by saying that only things that white people don't think they do make
Mhm.
something Indigenous. I
Mhm.
mean, the history of colonialism is sort of 500 years of hungry, hungry hippo in terms of them kind of like possessively claiming things. So
Right.
if we create our definitions of who or what indigeneity is based on things that Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks think that we don't do, that is a sure recipe for extinction. So what does it mean to sort of like look at everything in particular and say, okay, how can we take control of that? How can we make that less possessive and more relational? What are the kinds of things that we have to do in order to do it that way? And what does that look like in a data context? What does that look like in a statistics context? And so that's what I'm interested in, and that's why I talk so much about the idea of a social field. When you think about the forms of capital and the forms of hierarchy that exists in sort of like social arenas, and they can be whatever the education arena, the statistics arena, the medical arena, the legal, whatever. There's all people in them that have particular kinds of competencies that allow them to kind of like live their lives in the professional ways that they do it. Us not being involved, us as Indigenous folks not being involved in the collection, analysis, and communication of data has actively harmed us.
Mhm.
So how do we change that? What does it look like to change that? So when you think about the Regional Health Survey, for example, which
Yep.
comes out of an argument out of the Statistics Act, um, what positive impact has that had? When you think about the Inuit health survey that they've just finished, which is unbelievable. It's incredibly sophisticated. It's incredibly values laden and values oriented. There are ways to do this in a good way. There are ways to do this in an ethical way. It doesn't mean that we have to get rid of statistics. And even if we wanted to get rid of statistics, we couldn't.
Right. Yes. Thank you. I know that you're not looking at the chat, but the chat is exploding with gratitude for, again, the clarity and explicitness that you're using. So I really am still struggling with this. I like the hungry, hungry hippo analogy. If you haven't read Chris's book on Indigenous statistics, if you like the hungry, hungry hippo analogy, I highly recommend you read both chapters where Chris is the primary author, because you talk a lot about, I think you call it white possessiveness.
Yeah.
Is that right? And that really helped clarify some things that I was still foggy about in terms of Indigenous data sovereignty. And to kind of, I'm going to ask a question, and then folks, I'm going to also take an actual pause to see if anybody wants to jump in with their reflections or questions. But we have done a couple of public health Indigenous data sovereignty projects. They involved making sure that I would say on a maturity scale of Indigenous data sovereignty, they were in their infancy, like very immature, just struggling to try and figure out how to understand this in concept and then apply it in practice. And one of the things that we made sure, but I now see this probably as embedding white possessiveness into Indigenous data sovereignty, is making sure that the survey was co-designed with
Mhm.
any tribe or nation that was going to be answering it, and that all of the data was hosted on computers that were on native owned land, and um, and that the control and access of that data was also in tribal leaders' hands. But what we didn't do was put all of the other data that was collected in that public health survey onto those same servers and into the same decision-making hands, right? So it was anybody who checked a box, how you started this conversation, who said they were, a member of a tribe or self-identified as First Nations, like they kind of went into the Indigenous data sovereignty pot. And then
Mhm.
somebody who checked like I'm a European or I'm like from Africa, they went into like the public health pot. So their data went on a different server, and the public health kind of elected officials in that county were in charge of that data. And that seems really weird to me. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are of like, what if all of the data went into the Indigenous data sovereignty pot? Um, Instead of to the public health people, like what if the public health people had to ask for their custom tables from the tribal data practitioners instead of saying, okay, you get Indigenous sovereignty over Indigenous data? What if they had sovereignty over all of the data that public health department collected? Because it seems to me like these principles are really good for everybody. And my real fear and concern at thinking about that or suggesting that is that I am displaying white possessiveness and being like, well, your ideas are great. Can we apply them to everybody?
Yeah, I'll say two things on that. One is I'll maybe tie this to a reconciliation context in Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
The fundamental philosophical premise of reconciliation for me is non-Indigenous people moving their ethical position from one of Indigenous peoples are problems that need to be solved to what does it mean to work in reciprocal partnership with Indigenous
Hmm.
peoples.
Hmm.
So having
Yep.
said that, I'll make 2 points. One, I mean, certainly you are entitled to your own kind of feelings and experiences about this, but as a non-Indigenous person, you don't get to decide on your own whether something is white possessive or not. And so kind of like connected to that is have a conversation with them.
Right.
And then the second part of that is what's their capacity to actually hold those data? Because that's the
Hmm.
other part, right? Like we're dealing in many situations where people, because there's been a statistical field that has actively attempted to push and keep them out, don't have the requisite data literacy, or for that matter, the infrastructure to be able to actually hold all of
Hmm.
those data and all of those data sets. And so, from
Hmm.
my
Yeah.
perspective,
Hmm.
20 years ago when I first started as a professor, I had just read this amazing book, Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Smith, who's, if you've never met her, she's just an absolutely lovely person. And me and a colleague got invited out to a local First Nation because the internet was just coming into the First Nation and they were trying to figure out how big a server they needed. And so, armed with this book, we went into the community and we met with folks and just by just a piece of context, these folks were not these were very ceremonially competent folks. And so we started having discussion. They said, well, how would you see the project going? And I said, well, I thought we could bring in some elders. We could start this off in a good way, blah, 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 blah. And this lady kind of was looking at me and blinking. And she said, yeah, she said, or we could just do a survey. So the point being, why did I think I knew in advance what the
Right.
right methodology and what the right kind of ethical lens was for working with the community, as opposed to just having a conversation with them and, as you guys did, co-design what was actually necessary for getting the information that they
Hmm.
needed. And this is the thing about how good data relationships work. There has to be a sense of co-design. There has to be an acknowledgement of, in some cases, the different levels of capacity and infrastructure for doing this, and then thinking about what what possession. I don't mean white possession in a white possessiveness context. I mean what possession actually looks like in terms of who's got the infrastructure to actually hold that
Mhm,
data and keep them stable.
mhm. Thank you so much. That's very, very helpful clarification on my thinking. I really appreciate that, Chris. Great. As promised, I'm gonna stop talking for a minute and see if any of you want to put a question into the chat, want to turn your microphones on, make a reflection. If not, Chris, I have, of course, hours worth of questions, but is there something that you wish that you were talking about to us or we're adding to uh, our
No,
ideas?
I mean, again, I could talk about this stuff for hours. So there's never, and every time I talk about these kinds of things, depending on the experiences of the folks I'm talking with, they always go in. So one thing maybe I will say, and I feel like I'm talking a lot here that may not quite be on point, but one of the things that I am quite honored to be able to get to do is every 2 years I teach an Indigenous health data sovereignty course for the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health at UBC. Dr. Nadine Caron and her crew do an amazing job of running that. And every 2 years they hold this short course. And one of the things I did this year was I created a deficit data escape room. And so what it did basically was that I created 4 tiers, and people broke up into groups, and we created 4 tiers. I gave them a very deficit-based a newspaper article, and then they had to work through that newspaper article, getting pieces of additional information to turn it from a deficit-based discussion into a strength-based discussion. And it was fascinating to me, not because I thought I did a particularly good job of creating the escape room, although it took about 25 hours. But what was amazing was all the different ways in which people could bring their frontline experience, their own situated knowledges to be able to better contextualize the data and the communication that was coming out of the data. And the stories they produced at the end were they were mind blowing. They were amazing. They were pragmatic. They were good faith outcomes of the process. Like they just didn't sort of like say, I don't care what the world is like. This is what I want to see. And so I think thinking about data communication from a puzzle-based perspective, I'm just getting into it now, but I think it's a really, really useful way of thinking about how to tell more compelling stories with data.
Thank you so much for that example. That is very, very cool. And I may look into how to attend that class because I would love to learn more. One thing that people are asking about in the chat, and I'm not really sure if you want to go there or not, is about the role of AI.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it's totally fine to just be like pass
No, no, no,
or
no, no.
okay.
It's something that we're definitely dealing with. There's a somewhat of a dated term now, but I think it still kind of makes sense structurally that many of you might have heard of called the data divide. And so that's sort of the divide between folks who have kind of the literacy and the capacity to kind of like do things, creatively with data, and then those who don't, who haven't had the opportunity to build the same literacy or have the same kind of infrastructural capacity, continue to lose out as data collection and analysis continues to expand and get more complicated. People often say sophisticated, but I mean complicated because I'm not sure we're any better off with the stuff that gets produced out of it. But I think that the same types of power-laden inequities that exist with data are going to get exacerbated with the use of AI and kind of its application to data analysis. I think that for sure there is an increased amount of agency that can come with the growth of AI, but you're still running into all the same infrastructural problems and all the same literacy problems And of course, some of you may know this better than I do, but when you don't get to control the algorithms that produce all the shortcuts for you, then I took a storytelling an organizational storytelling certificate through Georgetown University last year, and one of the things that we had to do is that we had to use AI to write a story on anything that we wanted AI to write the story on, and I asked it to write a story on a Métis a female Métis data analyst that was working for some type of financial organization, and the horrific stereotypes that came out that I then had to sort of like work through. And because the first part of the story was use AI, the second part of the story was to then correct any of the hallucinations or plain wrong information that you see. And so we're in a situation where the complexity of our sociality comprises such a small amount of the data that are actually out there that when all these data scrapes happen, all these different things, we sort of like we continually lose out. And synthetic data are constructed, the same thing. We end up we losing out. And to go back, Heather, to what you were talking about earlier, if part of the job of Indigenous statistics and Indigenous studies more generally is to make things that seem simple and break them down into smaller chunks to make them more complicated. AI doesn't help us do that. All AI does is create more chunks of stereotypes and simplifications and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So could it be helpful? For sure. But I just attended a job interview last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago now, of a Nigerian language model. She was a computational linguist, and she was looking at the power of AI to rebuild some languages of indigenous folks in Africa, and she found that what it actually did was to increase the use of English because the models were so bad that people ended up having to talk to each other in English as a way to actually communicate across stuff. She doesn't think it'll always be like that,
Right.
but you start to see kind of the impact of the data divide and the ways in which those power inequities, those racialized inequities, get reproduced when that divide isn't attended to through an equity or a social justice lens.
Absolutely. That's a great example. Thank you for sharing, especially the increased use of English out of the idea that the tool was going to make an increased use of an indigenous language. I think there's this idea of white people thinking that they're going to do something that is in alignment with their truth and reconciliation goals when it isn't, is also something that your work is very, very good at clarifying. Can you and you helped me a little bit already on this today, but can you talk a little bit more about how you write about the most important bit is if statisticians or data practitioners are gonna work with communities, which so many people here want to do, we have to start by examining the idea of good or the idea of better.
Yeah. 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 So this goes down to kind of like the divide between making numbers technically proficient and making them policy relevant. I'm less, like I said earlier, I'm less interested in whether numbers are technically accurate. I mean, they should be technically accurate. That's the whole point of paying someone to do the work. I'm interested in how policy relevant they are. So how well do they actually align with the organizational values that we say we espouse? And do we have in my case, Indigenous folks who have the type of literacy necessary to make the call about whether that is actually happening or whether that is actually the case? And so for me, good data are data that are policy relevant. I take technical accuracy as more or less a matter of course. And I know for those of you that do work in this area, you're rolling your eyes at me right now because it's in fact incredibly complicated to make technically accurate data. But I will say that I tend to differentiate between cake bakers and cake decorators. Cake decorators are the demographers that have these increasingly sophisticated tools for making data more and more accurate. And listen, this isn't a shot or a dig at cake decorators. The Food Network has whole shows that are dedicated to cake decorating, but we need more bakers because by the time we get to the part where the
Right.
where the cake decorating takes place, oh, this is a happy metaphor that actually fits. It's already baked into the cake. So we need to be involved in the actual ingredients that's baking the cake. Otherwise, have any of you guys ever seen that show on Netflix called Nailed It, where they've got the original piece and then they get the piece that some amateur comes along to try and reproduce, and it's like
Yes.
that's not what that looks like at all. That's what this ends up looking like, as long as we don't presume in advance that the
Right.
original thing is the most technically accurate, but the original thing is the most value aligned.
Yes. Thank you so much for putting it that way. Great analogy. Happy to see it come round. And that's what really also got me interested in data equity upstream
Yeah,
is this idea of like, these kind of meaning making data parties are very important. Like once you've got your results and you're,
yeah,
as you've referred to, kind of try and do an asset-based communication of the results. But if nobody's paid any attention before that, those results are absolutely going to be so drenched in power and privilege.
yeah.
Like
And
even
they will be completely technically accurate and still useless.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm so interested in breaking through this idea that it is possible using any recipe, any methodology of statistics to produce value neutral numbers. You
Yeah.
cannot do it
No.
with all the money, all the statisticians, any of that stuff.
No, because I will say, sorry to interrupt you, Heather, because this
No,
is something I feel in support of what you're saying. This is something I feel really strongly about. The power of statistics in our society, the rhetorical power of statistics in our society is that they they tell us stories about some underlying reality, right? That's the ontological promise of statistics, is that they give us a 100% correlated look into kind of like this underlying reality. My point is that statistics are a lens for looking at reality. And if any of you've ever been I just got glasses as you get into your 50s and everything goes to pot. My vision's gone to shit over the course of 3 months. So I got these glasses and I loathe having them. But what I found really interesting is that when you go to the eye doctor and they do they flick the lenses in front of you, go better or worse, better or worse, better or worse. That's what you're doing when you're working with community, when you're working with nations to figure out there's no one best way to do it. It's whatever people can agree to, the amount of ambiguity that they can live with because they trust each other, right? So if any of you have worked in community and you go into community, you know that the reason you're there is not necessarily the reason why they want you there, but they want the money that you're coming with you, and so what you do is you build a relationship of trust, so that allows you to kind of navigate that ambiguity corridor that exists between why you're there and why they want you there. It's okay that the idea of the reasons you're there are not fully aligned. That's totally fine. It's building trust that allows you to live with ambiguity, and that's why good relationships can produce good numbers, because they allow you to live with that ambiguity. You can't, it's very, I won't say there's no situation in which good numbers can produce good relationships. Um, but numbers are, by their nature, abstracting vehicles. And so you're always going to have ambiguity in those numbers, depending on which lenses you use to create them. So if you both are involved in the lenses, if you're both involved with being able to say better or worse, better or worse, better or worse, I still can't tell whether I can see as good as I can see now, but I can certainly see a hell of a lot better than I could before I put them on, sadly, because I got a say in what the lenses were. And that entire social field, the entire statistical field works in exactly the same way. You get whether you're indigenous, non-indigenous, if you're in positions of leadership where you get to say better or worse in all those different, in the conception, in the collection, in the cleaning, in the analysis, and in the communication, that makes more value aligned data because you got to say better or worse all throughout that entire cycle.
Thank you so much, Chris. That is it's so nice to talk to somebody with so much authority and clarity at the same time. And your analogies are in your storytelling is so penetrating and uplifting.
Thank you.
I really am so grateful for the thinking and the working that you do and for your willingness to come and share. This is like, I'm not exaggerating when this has absolutely been one of the highlights of my year. So thank you so
Oh,
much for joining us. I'm very sad that we're at the top of the hour. but I'm very grateful for the hour that we have had. I'm going to share the link one more time because I know that people here are going to want to share these ideas with their colleagues, with their friends, refer back as you go through your work and, try and take steps towards truth and reconciliation. We're going to share links to all Chris's work and the related books that were mentioned, Decolonizing Methodology, another great link we'll put in there. And this is what We All Count is about, is exactly what the idea that you really need to pay attention to the choices that we as practitioners are making upstream. And that's what our practical tools are here to help you for. So if you liked this talk, come back. Share your ideas. We love to learn together. Chris is being incredibly generous by putting his email in the chat on the very week that he is becoming the dean of social science at the University of Alberta. These sessions are not sponsored, but our guests are absolutely paid because we respect and love them. So if you want to make a contribution, refer a friend or colleague to one of our courses. And if you want to take one of our courses and you're unemployed or you're going through turbulence, just write to us. We'll always find a seat for you because what we're really doing is trying to build community here. So we are going to leave it here. Please take very good care of yourselves and each other. And Chris, I cannot thank you enough for the time that you've invested to get yourself here and the time that you've shared with us. I'm so grateful, Chris.
Heather, very kind of you to invite me. I'm honored. Thank you all for taking time out of your day. And if you ever want to invite me back, happy to come back again.
All right, I'm going to take you up on that for sure.
Awesome.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.